I've been working on an analytical system, trying to figure out which models and what information is most predictive. And yet the more I drill down into the nuances and minutiae of current events, the lower the marginal return on that investment seems to be. In fact, if anything, cutting out noise is more effective than adding that minute bit more signal. I've tried looking at markets. I've tried watching the big power players. I've looked at raw economic data, and I have paid attention to changes in credit. I have looked at a great many things and all of them are useful. But if there's one thing that's more predictive than anything else, it's treating our modern informational landscape as a field of stories. What drives markets? It's the stories that investors tell themselves. What drives politics? It's the stories that the population believes. What drives conflict? It's the narratives that exist between those involved. People think in stories. Those who wield power have always understood this. A system builds itself upon its foundation myth, and an elite stands atop its right to rule story. If we pay attention to the stories that exist within our world, and look at conflicts not as a competition of resources, strength, logistics, and numbers, but instead as a fight between competing stories, then we can find some really remarkable predictive power. I've been making use of AI and statistical models for this purpose, following news and social media, paying attention to big commentators and bot posts. While everything feels so intense right now, while so many are scared and angry, so much of the global geopolitical conflict is a narrative war. To dive into this idea, let's look at some of the major factions that the populations have clumped into. Generally, people tend to think of there being different ideological groups, factions committed to their beliefs and ideologies, whether Marxists, liberals, conservatives, populists, libertarians, or however one wishes to divide up these clusterings. The common wisdom is that the populations have divided themselves up into teams. One looks at these teams and sees what looks like groups committed to some ideological position. Yet so much of what we perceive as being a group is really just a clustering around a story or set of stories. Most people, in fact, do not have opinions nor analyses. Certainly there are many who do. Yet by and large, for most people, affiliation with one of these factions can be largely broken up into economic self-interest and emotional disposition. The stories that form the bases of these ideologies are really post hoc rationalizations for these economic interests and emotional dispositions, and then secondarily to retain emotional investment. Let's take a look at some of these broad groups, looking in a very big picture general sense. Let's begin with one of the most common groups, the establishment and centrist liberal. Generally, this sphere will be made up of those who are middle class or lower upper class. Generally, this will be white-collar workers with undergraduate or advanced degrees. If one has such credentials, then such a person will tend to defend the idea of credentials, insisting that those who are credentialed should be trusted and looked up to, as if one has based their economic position and/or their status from having such a credential, then it is within his or her interest to defend the idea of the credential itself and the credentialed class. If one has achieved a comfortable position in this economic model, then one is very likely to defend it, being afraid of disruptions to the status quo. Take, for example, those who were so aggressively opposed to the idea of tariffs. How many actually understood the economics of what would happen? Well, turns out, most of the economists didn't either. Most of the time, as was in the case of the 19th century Corn Laws, those who derived their wealth from international capital were opposed to it, while those who were more tied domestically were generally more in support. The defense or opposition, stated as a sort of ideological or economic theoretic position, was almost entirely a justification after the fact. If globalization makes you wealthier, then you do not want tariffs. If your wealth comes from your local environment, or if you are tied to the real assets of the domestic nation, then you support them. This tends to be a comfortable class, and generally as degree holders and those in the middle class, the ranks of this group tend to be made up of those who followed the rules, as it were, went to university, got the 9 to 5, then moved into the nice condo in the city or to the suburbs. These are generally more risk-averse people, and as such will have a natural aversion to chaos. As these are people who are already invested in the system as it has been, if one perceives a chaos agent to be present, particularly one that threatens the status quo, then that person will become very afraid. In the case of the United States and much of the Western nations, this manifests via the scapegoat of the populists. In reality, the old system was failing regardless. It had failed too many people. The financial and economic model could not be sustained. The global rules-based order had simply fallen apart. It was going to end naturally, as all things do. Yet if one has based their social status and wealth from that system, and from its right to rule story, then one will seek emotional solace in telling a story that everything was going great until these vile chaos agents showed up to tear it apart for no reason. They must just want destruction for its own sake. It's easier to scapegoat this villain than to accept that the system that has given one their status itself had failed. Owing to this investment in the system as it has been, its fundamental stories, and its credentialing mechanism, these people are much more likely to believe the institutionally approved messengers and media sources. Ultimately, by extension, trusting CNN means that your degree is more important than it really is. Or perhaps getting your news from the Wall Street Journal means that you were supposed to have that wealth for some moral reason. Ultimately, their main fear is chaos and uncertainty. They do not want to rock the boat. Yet as more and more of their underlying stories fall apart with more and more of the populations no longer believing in them, this faction has largely been stuck attempting to undermine the narratives of others, as it is too difficult to bolster their own stories. Turning to an adjacent faction, let's look at the loose coalition of establishment conservatives and neocons. They, in many ways, share similar values of the system as it has been, yet instead of deriving their right-to-rule story from the tenets of liberalism, asserting that they have the right to be in this class because they are uplifting the downtrodden, this broad sphere tends to justify itself via continuity, duty, and obligation. Considering themselves to be civilizational stewards, they have a self-image of being calm and level-headed, fundamentally aligning with the establishment liberals in a broad sense, yet believe themselves to be the moderating sense, the calm level head that pulls them back from their worst instincts. They as well tend to have an emotional disposition to order and rules. While also emotionally attached to liberal universalism, they, and particularly the neocon wing, tend to hold to liberal imperialist views, while the establishment liberal justifies the system from the post-war era, pointing to Franklin Roosevelt's progressivism and the functional Second Constitution of the Civil Rights era. This sphere of conservatives tends to point to the original 18th century Constitution as its justification, insisting that it is still active. Generally, people find themselves here with a fear of change and an emotional disposition to nostalgia, valuing that feeling of continuity with a sense that they are preserving the old. These tend to be people who look back and say, "Look how great all this is." They hope to be the steady hand that keeps it in place. Yet as their self-image revolves around constraint, they are very easily politically outmatched, themselves unwilling to ever truly wield power in a way that results in substantial changes. One could largely sum this emotional state up as a wistfulness for the way things were. Let's take the cluster of progressivists and Marxists. Generally, they are motivated by a fear of alienation. They tend to take their positions via social proofs. Here we see a tendency toward conformity, and a fear that if one is seen to be the weakest link within the sphere, then that puts one at risk, knowing that others will most likely turn to them first when attempting to prove their ideological bona fides. And so this creates a great weakness. In order to feel that one is more protected from being alienated and ostracized, one must point to others who are impure, constantly pushing out those who do not purity spiral. A great motivator is the fear of being on the wrong side of history. Here we see the social proof tendency repeat again, the point being not to be correct within one's own sense and analysis, but to be right within social judgment. As there is a sense of unidirectional history, this leads to the assumption that one must push further and further in the direction of Marxism, and hyper-liberal progressivism. Those who have an emotional disposition toward weakness, a fear of being the outsider, a need for validation, or a self-image of insufficiency and insecurity with oneself, particularly match well with this belief set. This is a system which justifies being that weak figure. The story emotionally supports such a person, saying that weakness, being small, being insufficient is actually morally righteous, that those who are self-sufficient, those who have positive self-image, those who are great or who aspire to greatness, are in fact the villain. This is a perfectly sculpted belief set for one who has low confidence and feels more secure in demonstrating oneself to be part of the group than being judged as an individual. To perhaps be harshly terse, it is justifying the loser. Let's look at the nationalist populists. The economic motivation is very straightforward. These are the people who were failed by the old system. It's no wonder that its ranks are so heavily made up of those in the Rust Belt, the working and rural lower classes. While much of establishment liberal belief is a justification for why the globalization of capital was a moral good, this is its fundamental opposite, as quite often these were the people who that economic system directly hurt. These people will naturally have a very deep distrust of the credentialed and the institutional storytellers, and this is in large part because those are the people who have been telling them that everything is fine, or worse than that, telling them that they are evil for complaining. These are the people who were told that they are stupid for saying anything is wrong. Now, the reason that they were treated that way is because in order to emotionally justify their own status, the establishment liberal must shun these people. It must be assumed that these people are either wicked or stupid or defective in some way. For if the problems that they raise were ever tackled head-on, it would fundamentally undermine the right-to-rule story, and more than that, it would call into question whether those wealthier classes were actually a force for good, and whether there is any ethical justification for their wealth. As these people have been so directly hurt by globalization and internationalist systems, generally these people have a psychology of sovereignty. Seeing that they have been pushed around by people and institutions far away from them, they have learned to place most value on themselves, their families, and their towns. By extension, in the global geopolitical conflict, placing value on their nation, and naturally as a result, seeing globalization as an enemy. This group has one very striking emotional weakness, however. For so long, they have been betrayed by the institutions that have said they are there to help them. They have been betrayed by their government, by the businesses of their country. They have been betrayed by the media. They have been betrayed by the institutions and the experts. And thus, there is a natural sensitivity to betrayal, becoming hypersensitive and paranoid toward the risk of being betrayed from within. This naturally leads to a real trust problem. Seeing little deviations or things they don't understand, and blowing that up into, oh no, we've been betrayed, stabbed in the back, it's all over, everything's doomed. This fundamental problem has been taken advantage of by those attempting to undermine their stories and their interests. Libertarians are a quite interesting group as well. In large part, they can be defined by oppositional defiance, a rejection of anyone presenting himself as authority. They quite often take to intellectualizing, finding more comfort operating in abstractions than in hard, practical reality. It's quite reasonable, then, why so many of them are dedicated to economics, as this is a field that works perfectly to both address questions of individualism and freedom, and for abstraction and intellectualization. They fear impositions from others, placing a very deep, almost sacred value on individual freedom. This combination, however, leads to a real problem, as this abstraction and intellectualization lends itself very easily to ideological purity standards. There really isn't any way for them to prove themselves to be moral within their own systems, as their systems do not exist, and are fundamentally more of a philosophical exercise. Thus, in order to demonstrate their morality, they have to prove themselves to be intellectually pure, showing that they are more libertarian than others. A real problem that existing in this mode has is that quite often it will lead someone to be very uncomfortable with real situations in which they must exercise power or make decisions that could have a real-world effect. This psychology and worldview requires one to be the outsider. The only way to hold oneself to those moral purity standards is to be an outsider who can exist in abstraction. If a libertarian were ever given power and were forced to make practical decisions, then he would quickly find that he could not hold himself up to those standards he had set for himself and others. So naturally, he will tend to find an argument as to why he is actually still the outsider, absolving himself from the needs to make practical political decisions, and disassociating himself from whoever is in power. If a libertarian were to become the emperor of the world, quite quickly the libertarians would all find some way to say that that guy is not a libertarian and is actually their enemy, thus placing themselves back on the outside and able to operate in a morally pure, abstracted, intellectualized state. Another group we could look at are the Christian nationalists. They tend to be driven by a profound sense of hope and purpose, finding strength through community and a sense of moral clarity. Their primary fear is divine judgment, and they fundamentally lament the loss of cultural moral standards. These tend to be people who are very sensitive to feelings of purity and sanctity. Owing to a heightened sense of sanctity, these will tend to be people who place very high value on symbols, being very sensitive to perceived attacks on symbols. One weakness, however, is a real fear of moral uncertainty, generally forcing out elements which could create such a muddying of the waters. This doesn't lead to quite the same purity spiraling that we've seen in others, but can lead to some rather aggressive protectiveness. On a very deep level, they are afraid of being erased, though they do draw a great sense of moral purpose from being engaged in a spiritual fight, placing a great moral value on martyrdom. And one last one that we will look at is what has been loosely called the truth movement. These are people with a very deep distrust of narratives. Quite often, this can be very effective, allowing them to see through things that so many others get caught up in, often allowing them to gain information that most people don't have. However, the downside of this is that very often they lose the ability to trust. This can spiral off in two directions. One, being easily drawn in by all sorts of things, being caught up in truly wild stories that are untrue, or being so unable to trust that they can't believe in anything. Very often, too, they will become prideful, deriving a sense of status by demonstrating understanding, showing themselves to be those who have broken through even more levels of falsehood. One arena in which this is demonstrated is by competing on the grounds of prediction. If one understands the truth better than others, then he should have more predictive power. These tend to be very intelligent people, and those who have very high confidence, and a comfort with feeling like an outsider. While there are some enormous benefits to this psychology, it can be very high risk, high reward. Beyond the natural downside of being a bit alienated from most people, the risks of believing either too much or nothing at all are quite present, being the major pitfalls that such a person must contend with. So looking big picture at the state of our stories, the old stories of the system are falling apart. The stories of global liberal democracy relied on momentum, and without a constant momentum of those narratives, it will not be possible to recapture belief in that story. By and large, the stories of the order, the wartime foundation story, the story of liberal universalism, the story of uplifting the downtrodden and the breaking of chains, the story of the prosperity of globalization, the story of the expert class, the story of democracy, and of the representatives of the people. These stories have mostly been rejected, being held onto primarily by establishment liberals as means of emotional comfort and status justification. Establishment liberals find that they must blame nationalist populists. Number one, they must be rejected so that their grievances are not taken seriously, for their grievances point to the failure of the liberal establishment, and if accepted, would serve as proof that the stories of the liberal establishment are false. They as well cannot accept that the system has naturally failed, and must consider the nationalist populists to be intentional chaos agents. At this point, a set of new stories have emerged, and they are in the process of being told. Stories of how the old system failed, stories of betrayal, and stories of national sovereignty. And in order to entrench these new stories as the basis of a new regime, these stories require gripping examples in order to push forward. The major national populist figures require there to be gripping storytelling examples in order for them to successfully tell their stories, and have them be received. While the stories of the old system fall apart, increasingly those bound to the old regime find that they are getting no success by attempting to retell their old tales. So instead, in this conflict of stories, they have found that their best strategy is to undermine the new stories. The new regime attempting to form must tell its stories convincingly, while the old regime must disrupt those stories. This is the narrative conflict that we are now in. For example, the new regime must tell the story of the failure of globalization and its economics, unable to tell the story that globalization was actually a great success. Knowing that it failed too many people, the old regime must instead disrupt that story by saying that the new regime is actually causing economic damage and introducing chaos needlessly. The new regime must tell a story of the failure of the rules-based order. Some examples used in this regard are the inability to address Latin American crime syndicates, the escalation of the Russo-Ukrainian war, and the current situation with respect to Iran. The primary strategy being used by the old regime is to take advantage of that disposition toward distrust and the fear of being betrayed, introducing new story elements, suggesting that the new regime's story of peace through strength and the power of a sovereign United States and sovereign great powers is actually a deception. Really, there is no interest in sovereignty, and what has actually begun is control by foreign elements and corrupt motivation. Where the new regime tells a story that the country can be prosperous if it rebuilds its industrial core and focuses on its working class. The old regime does not attempt to revive the story of globalization and cheap appliances in the store. Instead, it attempts to inject a story saying that really the new regime is simply looking out for corporations, serving the interests of the very wealthy. The core strategy in the story fight seems to be to flood the zone with competing stories that all point to distrust, each one a different variation on betrayal, hoping that with enough of them, enough people will be caught so as to forget the new story of sovereignty and an end to the old globalist economic and financial system. If one looks online, he will see a proliferation of stories that all tell people to doubt, distrust, and fear. Yet these are just stories. The power of stories has been known by the powerful for a very long time, and something that has been recognized is that if the populations were able to compare their stories, to listen to each other, to find common ground and understanding, and to discover where they have been manipulated, then the stories of the regime would be easily undermined. So now we see stories designed to ensure that no people can listen to others. Think back to ethnic grievance stories. For example, the idea that no blacks should ever listen to what whites have to say. Or perhaps the idea that anything that a Jew ever says is a lie. Perhaps some revivals of sectarianism. Certain Christians shouldn't listen to other Christians, for they are the ones who have gone astray. Think about how often you have heard, "Oh, don't listen to him, he's a blank. You shouldn't pay attention to what any of them say. Don't even listen to one of those." These stories are designed so that people will not listen to each other, lest they compare their stories and find commonalities and discrepancies with the stories of the regime. Quite customized stories of resentment have formed, unique narratives telling different groups that they are oppressed. But think what the contrary of this story is. The contrary is the story of Cain and Abel. Zoom out and one will see a constant conflict throughout history between those who are diligent and believe in the future, attempting to build it with sacrifice, and he who is driven by resentment, hating the successful and diligent, seeking revenge against God and being itself. And more as people buy into stories telling them that there is no future. The story of let it all burn has grown. Think about the preludes to war, the story of enemies at the gate, or secret infiltrators. These are the stories used to send young men off to war. Yet they have also been turned inward, crafting narratives of dangerous internal factions, of wild radicals who are a great threat. If people sufficiently buy into stories like these, then it doesn't matter if those dangerous factions were ever real. Civil conflict will happen on its own, just as the story was told. We have found ourselves in a place where there are only a few fundamental outcomes. Either number one, the old regime collapses and attempts to reset the system on its own terms. Number two, the new regime implements itself successfully and with minimal problems. Or number three, the new regime implements itself yet unsuccessfully and with a great deal of problems. Fundamentally, the new regime is a natural result of the failure of the old regime, the failure of its stories and promises. The establishment liberal and establishment conservative are fundamentally afraid of the idea of chaos. They fear a true change to the status quo. And yet, particularly in the case of the establishment liberal, he finds himself ever desperately clinging to the idea that the old regime may still come back, that perhaps we can go back to the 1990s. Yet one way or another, this is ending. So perhaps the old regime regains control and resets on its own terms. Many of those who fall into this story are those afraid of chaos, and those afraid that they may lose their position that they had in the old system. In their emotional comfort story, he hopes that the old system can return. However, if the old regime were to reset itself, that would require enormous wealth destruction and extreme wealth extraction from the population. There would need to be widespread debt failure. What would be required would be a collapse and reset of the credit system. The old regime would then need to use this to acquire real assets, either through seizures and theft, or via a war. In order to propel the terms on which the old system existed, this would require tremendous cultural extermination. There could not be populations with senses of themselves as there had been. This sort of system reset would require that people consider themselves to be part of an international entity without any sense of unique domestic peoples. This would as well require tremendous heavy state control. There would by necessity need to be capital controls, strict limitations on communication, and most likely heavy restrictions on movement. If the old regime attempted to reset on its own terms and to continue, there would by necessity need to be extensive destruction, and there would be no possibility of a high prosperity growth environment. Some align themselves with this vision, telling themselves that this would not be the case. Yet this is simply another post hoc rationalization, when really the hope is to hold on to the position that one used to have in the world as it was. If the new regime successfully implements itself, particularly with minimal problems during the process, then that would result in a substantial change to the makeup of the elite classes. There would be entirely new people at the top of the new elite, and for those who make up the old elite, this is simply unacceptable. Old wealth creation mechanisms would end, and more sovereign nations and powers would form with distinct spheres. Liberal globalism would end along with its stories. Old conflict agitation systems which were necessary for the old regime would be removed. Under this scenario, there would most likely be greater growth in prosperity, as many of the old wealth extraction systems would be gone. For the old elite, this is unacceptable, and for the old comfortable classes, this is scary. The last fundamental possibility is that the new regime does implement itself, yet it comes at a steep cost and is a very messy process. In this scenario, there would most likely be substantial economic disintegration. The old system would end regardless, as in any scenario. There would almost certainly be significant wars. Though not the preferred outcome for the old elite of the old regime, this hard-fought conflict is preferable to simply stepping back and relinquishing their position, as they would most likely extract all that they could, attempting to abscond. The world would ultimately move forward, but it would be at a steep cost. So this is where we sit. There are a few scenarios that stretch out ahead. The old elite want to reset the system on their terms. Yet for most of the population, this would be awful, as many of those old mechanisms are extremely destructive and would by necessity become far more destructive. Those who are comfortable in the old regime are very scared of the scenarios where the new regime is implemented, as their position is no longer certain, and it is quite likely that they will lose a degree of status. By and large, what we are living in is people telling themselves stories, and people telling stories to push forward their interests. One way or another, the old system is ending. Consider competing elite factions with contrary models that are in conflict, and a knowledge that most likely there will be some degree of negotiation between the two at the end. Each broad faction will use storytelling to obtain a maximally advantaged negotiating position. This is true for more granular factions as well. The more successful storytelling, the more one will be able to get as the new system forms. And as we go forward, the competition over what the next system will look like is being played in great part as a conflict between storytellers. And if one wants to figure out where we are likely going, maybe just read some of the great books of our history. It can be so difficult to live in this environment, constantly being unsure what is true or who to trust. Doubtlessly, you will hear competing voices telling you not to trust the others. So what do? Well, maybe there's no clear, easy rule. Maybe this is difficult. But if something feels wrong, it probably is. If there is something that is making you more and more confused, it's probably manipulation. If there's someone who is constantly sowing doubt, they are probably a manipulator. Those who tell you to turn on each other, narratives that make you afraid, confused, and distressed, they're probably just stories. Pay attention when something has an ineffable ring of truth to it. Allow yourself to relax. Allow yourself to have hope. And maybe the most fundamental rule is that you will know them by their fruits. Pay attention, and you will see that so much of what drives the world today is old archetypes and plot devices, for humans naturally form their worlds to tell stories.